folks? Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Spencer here, as well as myself, Brad. And in this episode, we're going to talk about defending against ransomware. Huge topic, lots of things to talk about. I don't think ransomware really needs an introduction, probably, if you're watching this. But maybe at a high level, we should kind of talk about why we wanted to do this episode. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. So I think ransomware is the biggest existential threat to most organizations, right? The combination of ransomware plus the extortion on the back end of it as well. Threat actors trying to kind of double dip. We did a podcast about the Verizon DBIR recently, 2024 DBIR. And I think it said ransomware accounted for 36% of all data breaches in their data set, which is pretty significant. And I think this is a common thread that ties all industries together, whether you're healthcare, you're a big hospital, or you're a law firm, or you're a bank or credit union, manufacturing. I think all industries kind of have ransomware as a big threat to them in some way, shape, or form. So I think a lot of the themes and discussion points, Brad, that we talk about from a defensive perspective transcends kind of those verticals. I think that's why it's a great conversation topic, because we're not just speaking to law firms. We're not just speaking to financial services. We're kind of speaking globally and kind of talking about things at a high level to give people some strategies and some tactics of their own to defend their organizations, right? So that's kind of why I like this discussion. And I think we haven't really talked about defending ransomware before. Yeah. So, what better time than now?
Yeah. And, there's a psychological thing about ransomware, at least from our perspective. My background is in the financial and banking industry, and it was top of mind every day. And in all of our risk-based conversations, anytime we would have tabletops, anytime we would have serious conversations about threat actors and scenarios. And I think it comes down to the fact that, somebody is coming into your environment, taking your stuff, and then holding it either at ransom or releasing it to the world. And I don't know which one's worse, but neither one of them sound great. And so I think, from my perspective, it's just scary, dude. It does not sound like a pleasant experience. It's different from the old, defacing websites. And it's like, oh yeah, you got me, bro. I didn't update a WordPress plugin. Cool. This is, potentially a business ending ordeal.
Yeah.
And so there are companies out there that never recovered. And if you're in a service industry, like a hospital or something, it could be life threatening.
Yeah.
So yeah, the implications are huge, and it's just fundamentally a scary topic, at least for me.
Yeah. And the thing that I always think about, and kind of my general advice when I start thinking about stuff like this, is being resourceful and using the tools that you have to your advantage, trying to be as resourceful as possible, trying to squeeze out as much value as you can from the tools that you have, rather than go out and spend millions of dollars on new stuff that you have to learn and manage and tune. My first biggest piece of advice for preparing to defend, right, is use what you have. Try to use the tools that you have already in your arsenal, and try to be resourceful with them. I know a lot of times, we'll do a pen test with an organization or with a client, and they'll detect us some novel way. It'll be some random technology, and it'd be random to us, right? It's not random to them because they've tuned it that way.
Yeah.
But there'll be this random alert, this random detection. We're like, man, that's really cool. That's a really interesting way that you've instrumented in your environment, specific to your environment, because you know your environment, and you detected bad activity because of it. So knowing your environment and trying to use the tools that you have at your disposal and get creative with them and resourceful is going to be a top piece of advice for me when it comes to preparing to defend.
Yeah. And I want to take that topic in another direction, right? This is not a buy a tool to solve problem. It is a very complex animal. And you are not going to solve it with a multi-million-dollar tool, no matter what the salespeople are telling you. And that's, I think, part of my reason for not talking about ransomware more is it has just been exhausted as a sales tool. It has been beat to death as a scare tactic to talk people into buying the next
Yep.
hotness, tool or product or whatever it is. And there's just nothing out there that I'm aware of that is a magic, silver bullet to solve the problem, despite what everyone might tell you. And you're right, a lot of this is just doing the fundamentals well. Anybody that's ever been spent any time around marksmanship, like that is what everybody preaches. It's not about being whiz bang, cool, fancy stuff. Just perform the fundamentals, but do them very, very well. And you can do that probably with the tools that you already have. So,
Yep. And part of preparing and planning is figuring out your legal obligations, your reporting requirements, right? Like, let's say something does happen, you want to have your ducks in a row when it comes to cyber insurance, when it comes to, legal,
yeah.
when it comes to authorities, the FBI or Secret Service, if you have to call them in for an investigation. You obviously want to have those plans figured out ahead of time. That's where your DR and IR plans, right? Your disaster recovery incident response plans are super important. And figuring out who to call, when to call them, at what point do you enact certain things in your incident response plan to call on certain people, right? I think that's an important part that we go through a lot of these incident response tabletops, right? And we have an inject, right? Like, hey, something happens. What do you do at this point? And it's a good learning exercise to go through those processes before the incident happens, right? You
Yeah.
want to figure that stuff out before bad things happen, essentially.
Yeah, and I will tell you too, one of the things that we used to do is we would pull in our legal representative. We would pull in some cases, we would even involve local law enforcement, like the local financial Fed, not
Yep.
Fed, the FBI usually is who would be working with us.
Yep.
And we had our insurance provider in these exercises that you're
Yep.
talking about, because one, we usually got credit for that, right? Like meaning that we would get a discount on our insurance deductible, or our law firm would be more apt to represent us if they knew that we were doing our due diligence. But more importantly than that is they usually have actual good insight and knowledge.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And the interesting thing with the tabletop scenario is if you do them well, you run
Yeah.
into scenarios and questions that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
Right.
Like I was doing a tabletop with a manufacturing company a couple of years ago, and we got into an inject, and it was like, well, if somebody tampered with the system, how would you know? Would you know if somebody manipulated the financial information in the system?
Right.
And they were like, well, yeah, of course we would know because the numbers would be wrong. And then we got digging into it further, and it's like, well, how would you prove it? Right? And how would you prove who made those changes and when? And then they got into the system and they're like, oh, well, we actually don't have good audit trails in the system. Maybe we should turn some of that stuff on or figure out how to get some of that information so that when it comes time for an investigation, we can figure out what we need to figure out in when something bad happens like that.
Yeah, man. And part of that, and we should really involve like the ISO team and have like a whole thing on tabletops, because I personally think there's a tremendous amount of value in them. And I'm glad that you put that in this list of things to talk about, because tabletops create an interesting dynamic within organizations. And, problem number one is people aren't honest with themselves when they're doing tabletops, because it feels like, and it feels adversarial. Right.
Yep.
And it feels like you're sitting in this room and all of these people are critiquing your life's work because you're the IT director,
Yep.
or the CISO or whatever it is. And so it feels like you need to defend yourself and you need to protect yourself. And it's really an exercise in how we can all improve and to identify gaps, right? But coming into these tabletops with that kind of mentality, and as people who provide tabletop exercises, making it non-adversarial,
Yep.
making it inclusive and understanding, and like, hey guys, we're not here to beat you up. We're literally just here to help you get better. But yeah, so that's one, the adversarial thing, and then the other is just being honest with yourself and being honest with everybody on the team. Like you said, oh yeah, we would know, dude. Well, that's an off the cuff comment. And then once you get down to it, we wouldn't know. We actually wouldn't know. Right.
Yeah. And it takes a good kind of like a tabletop lead or
Yeah.
scenario lead or whatever you want to call it, like the manager of the tabletop exercise, if they have that ability to kind of dig into those things in those areas where they see there might be some gaps or
Yeah.
something, that can provide a lot of value. And I refer to the Dr. Seuss book. I forget which one it is. It's like when things go wrong, and sometimes they will.
Yeah.
I always like to say, like, let's assume that if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. Like,
Yes.
we know that, like, you guys are up to snuff. We know everything's locked down. We know you're good, right? Let's
Yep.
just assume for a minute that the bad things that could happen have actually happened, and assume from that scenario, right? Let's assume the worst so that
Hmm.
we can figure out how to get better.
It sounds like you've done tabletops before, Spencer.
Definitely.
Yeah, and you're right that one of the things that we frequently get, and we had this happen so many times that we put it in the intro slides, was go with a scenario,
Yep.
because the thing we would always get was, well, that couldn't happen here.
Yep.
That wouldn't happen. And
Yep.
and my urge to immediately spin that over to the offensive security team and be like, make it happen, is
Yep.
strong. But the reality is, right, we're just here to step through the scenario. And so,
Yeah. Nobody
try
nobody
to
thought
avoid that.
SolarWinds could get hacked, or Microsoft could get hacked, or Mandiant,
Right.
or Google. Nobody ever thought they would, be able to suffer a security incident, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Until it happened.
Yeah, I guarantee you the guy that Darius just got domain admin on probably would not have bet on him getting that on, day two.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly.
So the other area of preparation I think is important, and it's gotten, I think it's become contentious lately, because I think there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this, and that's security awareness.
Yeah.
And I think security awareness works when you incorporate it from a culture perspective, where there's a culture of responsibility and security and awareness. And when you kind of decouple the awareness with the training, right? There's security awareness and then there's training. I think a lot of where a lot of organizations go wrong is they bundle it all together into security awareness training.
Hmm.
And it's this complete thing that is kind of devoid of realism and practicality. And it lacks a lot of the context of the organization, modern threats, and it just promotes people just not being truthful or not being honest or not coming forward when they actually see something, right? And I think that the security awareness in general has become a big industry, right? Like that's a big area of investment.
Yeah.
But I think there's a right way to do security awareness and a wrong way, and I think it's easy to get wrong because we have all these tools to help simulate phishing, and we have these companies that have hundreds of hours of training videos, and we have all this stuff and infrastructure built around it. Whereas what we really need is we need people to talk to each other and communicate and meet people where they're at, understand that they have a job to do as well. So I think this is kind of like a high contention area, but security awareness and just teaching some people the basics, the basic red flags to look out for, and not being overly reliant on them to prevent an attack, right?
Yep.
I put something out the other day. It's like cyber attacks are not end users' faults. Like if we're blaming users, there's something else broken, right? If a user can click a link and our organization ceases to exist, that's not a problem with the user. That's a problem with the process, with the technology, something, right? Something else went wrong that allowed that to happen, right?
Sure.
And there's so many different things that could go wrong in that scenario, right? So I'm pretty big on that right now. I think that's a very contentious topic, but I believe that there's a divide there with security awareness.
There is, man. And look, I think along the way, we as an industry have lost sight of why we do what we do. And so, if you ask the average director of IT or compliance officer, do you guys do security awareness training? They're going to say yes. And the problem is, we're not asking ourselves why. Why are you doing security? What problem are you trying to solve? Because if it's user education, you might not be solving that problem correctly. If you're trying to educate users on the security tools that are available to them, though that's a completely different objective. And so I think we've lost the way a little bit there because we're so eager to check the box
Yep.
of, yeah, man, we're phishing our users every month. Cool. And you probably have a really low click rate, right? And then we roll over to a true social engineering experiment and
Yep.
they bomb it
Yep.
because we're creating scenarios where these users can easily recognize that, and we're chasing the numbers. That was a big problem in the
Yep.
financial industry, was like, why is our click rate higher this month than it was last month? Well, dude, it's because we're evolving the scenarios. We're making it harder on them. We're trying to teach them
Yep.
more advanced ways to detect attacks. But to your point, you know let's look at the problem we're trying to solve, but let's also understand this is a layer in a multi-layer approach to
Yep.
security, right? And this is not meant to be the final solution.
Yep.
And in fact, like you said, if we're relying on it, we're probably wrong.
Yep. And yeah, and I think it comes from a place of good intention, right? Like we want to
Yeah,
educate people. Like of course, we as like IT people are like, why wouldn't you want to know what kind of malware there is and like what ransomware is and like what phishing is and the different types of social engineering? Like why wouldn't you want to know what that is? But in reality, like people need to know what they need to know to do their job and to a little bit to protect the organization. And I think it does come from a place of good intent.
hmm
Um, but I think there's a line where it gets to be like overly burdensome. Where like if you're sending
yeah,
out training every week and you're sending phishing campaigns every week and you're just like burdening people with these modules and then they fail and then they gotta watch like a 30-minute video. We're kind of inundating them in teaching them maybe more bad habits than good habits.
yeah, and I agree with that, dude. And if you are a security practitioner and you're honest with yourself, you've probably either been fooled or almost been fooled by a phishing email, right? You've looked at it and you're like, oh man, I better not click on that. And just for a
Yep.
moment, you almost made a mistake.
Yep.
And I mean, I've been there. Everybody has, if they're being honest with themselves. But here's the
Yep.
catch to that: we can't ask Billy Joe in the reception's office to be a cybersecurity expert. And if sometimes we have trouble discerning what's real or what's not, what do you expect them to do?
Yep.
They can't be experts in vetting URLs and domains and understanding all of those things. And so we have to give them the tools to be successful.
Yep.
We have to bring them up from a minimum level of knowledge and education, which I think is a reasonable standard. But then we have to put controls in place that supports normal user behavior.
Yep. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is on the contrary to what I just said, was that of course we should expect our users to not copy and paste commands into a run dialog, like that
Yeah.
article that was just released like last week or something like that. As there was a threat actor that used an interesting phishing technique where they used like JavaScript to copy something to the user's clipboard, and then with like the dialog box, they said, hey, just like press the Windows key R and then paste into the run dialog, and that is apparently a thing. So like of course we should teach users not to do things like that,
Yeah.
and we should expect them to be able to identify those things. I think is reasonable.
Right.
But I think there's diminishing returns the more sophisticated it gets.
I agree. I agree with that.
So the last kind of area in preparation I thought we would touch on is deception. Deception slash whatever they're calling it. What's another good phrase for it, Brad? Deception or active countermeasures, if you're familiar with that terminology.
Yep.
Making your environment hostile to attackers, right? Whether that's with honey tokens, canaries, honeypots, tar traps, XYZ. When you get into this area of technology and security, there's a lot of cool like deception technology out there. So that's something I think is interesting and very underutilized and underrated.
Totally.
Canary tokens, Thinks Canary or Thinks.
Thanks. Yeah.
I always get that name wrong in the podcast. I don't know why, but Thinks.
Yeah.
They're always posting stuff like on Twitter. It's like, we had this customer email us and they detected like real threat actor or a real bad guy or a real red team or whatever because of canaries, because of the deception technology that they offer. So the stuff does work. It takes, some understanding to tune it and to figure out where's the best place to put it, how to configure it and stuff like that. But that I think can go a long way. especially when we consider that a lot of these threat actors are just running playbooks, like
Yeah.
copy pasting from playbooks. Like with
Yeah.
the Conti playbook, they're copy and pasting right from an SOP, right? And they're not doing anything that's super super sophisticated. And if you put some canaries there, you put some deception technology in their path somewhere along the way, chances are good they're going to trip over it.
You're absolutely right, man. And it makes me sad to say this is probably the most underutilized tool in the blue team's playbook. And it makes me sad because it is both absurdly inexpensive by comparison to other security control
Mm.
mechanisms, and it is absurdly effective by comparison to other security control mechanisms. And so, we in the financial industry, one of the banks that I worked at, we successfully detected a malicious insider using a canary. And so we had sprinkled all over the place, man. We had Excel files, we had Word documents that, when they were open, they would blow up and they would
Yep.
create an alert. We had actual physical devices on various subnets that we thought were high risk subnets. And so, using that type of technology, again, it's easy to do for the most part, right? And the cost of this stuff is just minimal,
Yep.
and it's super effective. We've been caught on pen tests,
Yep.
by these things, and we're always super excited to see
Yep.
that level of maturity exists in an organization. So folks, if you're listening out there, and really, if you've been following the podcast for very long, you've heard us talk about these because we love them so much. But
Yep.
just check it out, because there are even open source tools. If you don't want to spend any money at all, there are open source tools out there that you can run, that do similar type things. But even the paid tools are inexpensive.
Yep. For sure.
So really glad to see that in this list.
Cool. So do we want to move on to like that was the preparation kind of phase? Is there anything else from like a prep stage that you think of, like before we get into some of the more tangible, like technical controls and things like that?
Yeah,
I
the only
guess we
thing.
didn't talk about backups really.
No, we didn't. We didn't. And so let's do that, and then we'll come to one topic that I want to mention that really kind
Yeah.
of incorporates all of these and kind of rolls it up. But
Yep.
yeah, let's touch on backups really quick.
Yeah, backups is one of those like foundational things of IT, right? Is having good backups. I come from an organization probably like you. So I came from financial services, used to work at an insurance company. You were in banking, financial services. So I'm assuming kind of the same mentality in IT. But so we were very concerned about having redundancy with our data.
Yep.
And making sure that we could access within a specific period of time. Like if something was corrupt or a system went down, we needed to be able to recover within a very specific window.
Yeah.
Because we had, in insurance, people are writing policies all the time, right? So there's new data getting written all the time. And if you only have a backup once a day, like you might lose an entire day's worth of business potentially, which could be, it could be millions of dollars, right? Like it could be very significant impact there. So we had to, be very stringent in our backup procedures and our processes and things like that. But at a fundamental level, I think everybody's heard like the 3-2-1 strategy, right? Three backups on 2 different mediums and one of those offsite, right?
Yep.
So you can make that what it is. A lot of people do tape backups and a virtual backup and then an offsite at a colo or whatever your combination is. But I think at the fundamental level, like just having good backups and testing those backups on a regular basis is fundamentally like a bare minimum thing for just operating in any organization, any business right now, is having backups and testing them on a regular basis to make sure you can recover. Bare minimum.
Yeah, and I'll borrow a buzzword from the industry, making at least one copy of those immutable, right? And basically, for those of you who don't know, that basically means that they can't be modified, right? And so that is a key element to this. You can solve that to a certain degree by having it on a separate medium. You can also have it off-site, et cetera. But just make sure that those aren't accessible, because we have very often seen backups becoming encrypted as part of ransomware attacks. And so keep that in mind. So one thing, just to kind of wrap up the preparation section, is I would encourage you guys to go out, do research on the threat actors in the ransomware space. This information is public. There are tons of researchers out there that are very frequently publishing papers on how these threat actors work, what they're doing, and look at their attack methods, look at their TTPs. And one of the things that we would do internally is we would go out, and every time a new one was released, we would look through their playlist, and we would say, how does this affect us? What are our controls around this? We actually put out internal white papers where we address specific threat actors and every single one of their known TTPs. And then we would have basically a box that was a chart, and it was just like, here are all the controls that apply to this specific step in their playbook. Here is their level of effectiveness, where they on a scale of 5, 1 is poor effectiveness, 5 is completely effective. and
Yep.
and just be honest and evaluate yourself and your security controls around these things, and you can go pretty far with that, again, using what you already have from a controls, technology, process perspective, and rate yourself against these threat actors, and that can be internal, that can be just one person looking at it, but that will help you evaluate your effectiveness at
Yep.
basically no cost other than time.
Yep. And a good resource for that place I love, I've mentioned it 100 times, is the defer report.
Yeah.
So the deferreport.com, they have every week they have a new analysis of a real intrusion by real threat actors, and they have Yara rules, they have Sigma rules, they have indicators, they have the timeline, they have the investigation itself and what techniques they used, and
Yeah.
in exhaustive amounts of information for you to be able to literally just recreate that attack in your environment if you wanted to, and do exactly what you said.
Awesome. All right, so external, you want to tackle that now, or you want
Yeah.
to break it off into a second part? We can edit this out if we need to, but
It doesn't matter if you want to. If you want to do like a part 2 and do like external, internal.
yeah, you want to just, we can reset here,
Yeah.
and then just split the video if you want.
Yeah, you want to just like wrap up this one, and then I can just cut it and we can start.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. So yeah, how do you want to do that? You want to do like in summary really quick and then roll out?
Yeah, so summary, and then we'll just mention like, hey, check out part 2. We're going to talk about external stuff and internal stuff, which is more like tangible, like controls and best practices.
Perfect. All right, folks. So just as a quick recap, leverage the things that you have, leverage the free information that's available to you out on the internet, about these threat actors, about how they work, and just master the fundamentals of security controls, and understand what you have is really kind of, I think, the big takeaway here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are, it's like kind of a cheesy saying or quote. I don't know who said it, but the time to have the plan is before you enter the woods,
Yes.
right? And the best defense is a good plan, is good preparation. And just like, that's why, in the military, they train all the time. Police, they train all the time. I think it's no different in cybersecurity. We have to be training, we have to be preparing, we have to be planning, strategizing, improving. And I think all that stuff is super important to do on a regular basis. So that would be my kind of closing thoughts on that.
Yeah, excellent. All right, folks. So that kind of concludes our preparation stage. This is going to be part 1 of a part 2 series on defending against ransomware. So in our second part, we're going to talk about some more specific controls that you can look at both internally and externally in your environment. So check us out next week for that episode. That's all we have for you today, and we'll see you next Wednesday.